I think we need to consider Damon for this.
Damon? You cannot be serious about that. Come on, Corinne, he's a driver. What's he going to talk about with people like us?
Maybe you should meet the man before deciding who he is. Damon?
Wait, is that him?
You know my driver?
You know my driver? The question had barely left Corinne's mouth when the older businessman's expression changed completely. He wasn't looking at Damon like a man recognizing someone's employee. He was looking at him like he had just seen somebody who was never supposed to walk into that room again. Around the long dinner table, forks slowly stopped moving. Grant's mocking smile disappeared. Damon remained near the entrance, calm beneath the soft chandelier light, one hand resting naturally beside his midnight blue tuxedo. The older businessman stepped away from his chair and stared at him. Then he said something that made Corinne's stomach tighten. Your driver? Corinne, do you have any idea who that man is? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Would you ever judge someone because of their job? Now watch what happened next. Corinne looked from the businessman to Damon. No, she said slowly. Apparently I don't. Damon gave the older man a respectful nod. Mr. Whitmore. That was all. But the name seemed to confirm something. Charles Whitmore was not an ordinary dinner guest. He was chairman of Whitmore Capital, one of the largest private investment groups on the East Coast, and the very man Corinne had spent 6 months trying to convince to invest in her company. Yet Charles was staring at Damon with more respect than he had shown anyone at the table all evening. Grant shifted uncomfortably. Charles, perhaps you're confusing him with somebody else. Charles didn't even look at Grant. No. His eyes remained on Damon. I never forget the face of a man who saved me $80 million. Silence. Corinne blinked. Grant actually laughed, but it came out thin and uncertain. 80 million. Charles finally turned toward him. That's what I said. Then he looked back at Damon. It's been what, 4 years? Almost 5, Damon answered. Corinne felt as though the floor beneath the table had tilted. For 11 months Damon had driven her to meetings. He had waited outside restaurants. He had carried her bags when she returned exhausted from airports. He had picked her up at 5 in the morning without complaining. He knew which coffee she ordered before difficult board meetings. He knew that she preferred silence after losing a contract. He had even once changed a flat tire himself in pouring rain because the roadside service was taking too long. And never, not once, had he mentioned Charles Whitmore, or $80 million. Grant pushed his chair back slightly. What exactly did he save you from? Charles smiled. A mistake. What kind of mistake? The kind arrogant people make when they think the quietest person in the room must be the least important. That landed harder than Grant expected. Several guests exchanged glances. Corinne slowly looked at Damon. You've met Charles before? Yes. Doing what? Damon paused. He looked uncomfortable for the first time that evening. Work. Grant scoffed. What kind of work? Damon looked at him. The kind that didn't require me to drive anyone. Someone at the far end of the table suppressed a laugh. Grant's jaw tightened. Corinne stepped away from her chair. Damon, please. Her voice softened. I'm not asking because of Grant. I'm asking because I've known you almost a year, and right now I feel like I've never met you. Damon studied her face. There was no accusation there. Only genuine confusion. Before he could answer, Charles pulled out the empty chair beside him. Sit down, Damon. Grant interrupted immediately. Hold on. This is a private investor's dinner. Charles looked at him. I know. I was invited. Grant frowned. Charles tapped the empty chair. And I'm asking him to sit beside me. Nobody challenged him after that. Damon walked toward the table. The confidence in his steps was subtle, but Corinne noticed something now she had somehow missed for months. He didn't move through that room like someone intimidated by wealth. He moved like someone who had seen it before. Damon sat. A waiter approached. Before Damon could say anything, Charles said, "Bring another setting." Grant leaned backward. "This is ridiculous." Corinne turned toward him. "No, Grant. What's ridiculous is that you were comfortable insulting him when you thought he was only my driver." Grant's eyes narrowed. "I didn't insult him." Corinne raised an eyebrow. "You spent 10 minutes making jokes about whether he knew which fork to use." Nobody laughed this time. Grant looked around the table and realized the atmosphere had changed. Damon quietly unfolded his napkin. Charles smiled. "You still do that?" Damon looked at him. Do what? Stay quiet while everybody else talks themselves into trouble. A few guests chuckled. Grant's face hardened. Corinne sat again. She wanted answers, but before she could ask another question, a waiter placed a menu in front of Damon. Damon barely looked at it. Charles leaned closer. So where have you been? Around. That's not an answer. It's the one I have tonight. Charles studied him for several seconds. Then he nodded. Fair enough. Corinne's curiosity was becoming unbearable. Charles, how do you know him? Charles looked at Damon, almost asking permission. Damon gave the smallest nod. Charles sat back. 5 years ago, my company was preparing to acquire a regional transportation firm. Corinne listened carefully. We had lawyers, analysts, accountants, consultants, nearly 50 people reviewing the deal. Everyone agreed it was excellent. What happened? She asked. Damon happened. Grant rolled his eyes. Charles ignored him. He was 29. Walked into the final review meeting and told me not to sign. Corinne stared at Damon. You? Damon said nothing. Charles continued. I asked him why. He told me our numbers were wrong. Grant folded his arms. One analyst found an accounting mistake? Charles smiled without humor. He wasn't an analyst. What was he? Charles looked directly at Damon. Founder. Grant's expression changed. Corinne froze. Founder of what? Charles answered. Coal Meridian. A glass slipped from someone's hand at the opposite end of the table. It didn't break, but the sound cut through the silence. Grant stared. Even Corinne knew that name. Everybody in their industry did. Coal Meridian had once been one of the fastest-growing logistics technology firms in the country. Its predictive software had transformed warehouse routing for dozens of major corporations. For 3 years, business magazines had called its anonymous technical founder a genius. Then something happened. The company was sold. Its founder disappeared. And within months, practically nobody heard from him again. Corinne slowly turned toward Damon. No. Damon's face remained unreadable. Grant shook his head. That's impossible. Charles laughed. Why? Because Damon Cole was worth. Grant stopped himself. Damon looked directly at him. Say it. Grant swallowed. Millions. Damon nodded once. I was. The table went dead silent. Corinne felt her heartbeat in her throat. She remembered every morning Damon had opened her car door. Every afternoon he had waited downstairs. Every time Grant had walked past him without even saying hello. Every occasion somebody had spoken around him as though he couldn't understand their conversations. But one question overwhelmed everything else. Why are you driving for me? Damon looked down at the table. For the first time, Charles looked away. Damon answered quietly. Because sometimes losing everything teaches you what having everything never could. Grant immediately leaned forward. So you did lose it. Damon looked at him. Most of it. Grant smiled again, relieved to find something he could use. There we are. A failed businessman playing chauffeur. Corinne's face hardened. Grant. But Damon lifted one hand slightly. It's fine. Then he looked at Grant. You're right about one thing. Grant raised his eyebrows. I failed. Nobody expected him to admit it so easily. Damon continued. I trusted the wrong people. I signed papers I should have read twice. I believed loyalty and contracts meant the same thing. Charles watched him silently. My business partner moved assets while I was negotiating an expansion. By the time I discovered what was happening, investors were panicking, lawsuits had started, and every newspaper wanted a headline. Corinne listened. Damon's voice remained steady. I fought for almost 2 years. And lost. Grant asked. Damon looked at him. I walked away. Same thing. No. Damon leaned slightly forward. Losing means somebody took your future. Walking away means you decided they weren't getting the rest of your life too. Charles smiled faintly. Corinne couldn't stop staring at him. That quiet man who drove her sedan every morning suddenly seemed like a stranger. Yet somehow he also seemed more like the Damon she had always known. Calm. Measured. Never desperate to impress anybody. Grant reached for his wine. So after building a multi-million-dollar company, you decided to become a driver? Yes. Why? Because I needed a job. Grant laughed. Damon didn't. And because I wanted one where nobody cared who I used to be. That shut Grant up. Corinne's expression softened. How did you end up working for me? I applied. She almost smiled. I know that. And you hired me. You didn't put Coal Meridian on your resume. No. You wrote that you had transportation management experience. Damon finally smiled. I did. Charles burst out laughing. Even Corinne couldn't help herself. Grant didn't find it funny, but the laughter died when Charles suddenly placed his hand on the thick folder beside his plate. Interesting. Corinne looked at him. What? Charles looked at Damon. Do you know why we're here tonight? Damon glanced at the folder. Investment discussion. Charles nodded. Corinne is asking us to fund Westbridge's expansion. Damon's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Grant noticed. What? Damon shook his head. Nothing. Charles knew him too well. That wasn't nothing. Corinne leaned forward. Damon, I don't want to interfere. Grant snorted. Finally, something sensible. Charles ignored him. What did you notice? Damon hesitated. Corinne looked at him. If you see something, tell me. Grant cut in. Corinne, this is a $120 million transaction. We're not taking financial advice from your chauffeur. Charles slowly put down his fork. Grant. What? If that chauffeur tells me this building is on fire, I'm leaving before I smell smoke. The table went quiet again. Damon looked at the documents. I've seen some of those projections before. Corinne frowned. How? I drive you. She didn't understand. You make calls in the car. Her face changed. Damon quickly added, I never deliberately listened to confidential conversations. But sometimes you discuss numbers on speakerphone. Grant leaned back. And Damon turned toward him. The margins you presented tonight don't match the numbers I've heard Corinne discussing with her operations team. Grant's face went still. Corinne looked at him. What does that mean? Damon looked at Charles. May I see the proposal? Grant immediately grabbed the folder. No. Everyone looked at him. Grant forced a smile. He's not authorized. Charles held out his hand. It's my copy. Grant didn't move. Charles's voice became colder. Give me my folder. Grant slowly released it. Charles slid it to Damon. Damon opened the document. One page. Then another. Then another. The entire table watched him. Corinne saw his eyes moving quickly over columns that had taken her finance team weeks to prepare. He stopped at page 37. Then page 42. Then he went backward. What is it? Corinne asked. Damon didn't answer immediately. He pulled a pen from beside Charles's plate. Your projected distribution cost for year 2 is here. He circled a number. 41 million. Corinne nodded. Damon flipped several pages. But your warehouse commitments require 53 million before labor adjustments. Grant jumped in. That is offset by vendor concessions. Where? Grant pointed. Appendix C. Damon turned to it. His eyes moved down the page. These aren't concessions. Grant's voice sharpened. Yes, they are. They're deferred obligations. Several investors leaned forward. Damon turned the document toward Charles. You're not saving 12 million. You're postponing it. Charles's smile vanished. Corinne grabbed her own copy. Grant's face reddened. This is absurd. He has looked at the document for 30 seconds. Damon turned another page. And this growth rate is based on 3 distribution contracts that expire before the expansion opens. Corinne's head snapped toward Grant. What? Grant shook his head. They're expected to renew. Expected? Charles repeated. Grant looked around the table. Yes, that's standard. Damon pointed at another line. Then why are they listed as secured revenue? Nobody spoke. Corinne's hand slowly tightened around the folder. Grant. He looked at her. Those contracts were confirmed. They will be. That is not what I asked. Grant exhaled. Corinne, don't do this here. Her voice dropped. You told the board they were signed. Grant stared at her. Damon closed the folder. I shouldn't have said anything. Charles looked at him. You absolutely should have. Grant stood. This dinner is over. Corinne stood too. No. Sit down. Grant stared at her. She had never spoken to him like that before. Corinne. Sit. He didn't. Charles closed his folder. Perhaps I should ask the question. Everyone turned toward him. He looked directly at Grant. Were those contracts signed when you represented them as secured revenue? Grant's mouth opened. No answer came. Charles nodded slowly. That tells me enough. Grant looked panicked now. You're going to take the word of a driver over the CFO of Westbridge? Corinne froze. Damon did too. Charles stared at Grant. Then he laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. That's your problem. Grant frowned. What? You still think his job determines the value of what he knows? Grant looked around the table. This entire evening has become insane. No, Corinne said. It just became useful. She took the documents. When were the contracts due to expire? Grant said nothing. Grant. Next quarter. Her face drained. And our expansion? 6 months later. So we're asking investors for 120 million using revenue we don't actually have guaranteed. We have verbal commitments. You told me signed. I said virtually signed. No. Corinne stepped closer. You said signed. Grant's anger suddenly appeared. And we would have closed them if you stopped questioning every decision. The room changed. Corinne stared at him. Grant realized too late how loudly he had spoken. He lowered his voice. I have carried this company through 2 difficult quarters. Corinne's expression became almost emotionless. You carried it? Yes. Damon watched quietly. Corinne nodded. Then perhaps you can explain something else. Grant's eyes narrowed. What? She opened her phone. For 3 months, you've been pushing me to approve the North Point warehouse acquisition. Grant said nothing. Every time my team questioned the price, you told me delaying would cost us the property. That was true. Damon suddenly looked up. North Point. Charles noticed. You know it. Damon looked at Grant. Who owns the holding company? Grant's face changed. Nobody missed it this time. Corinne slowly turned toward him. What holding company? Grant shook his head. This has gone far enough. He reached for his jacket. Damon spoke calmly. North Point Industrial isn't owned directly by the seller listed in your proposal. Grant stopped. Damon continued. It transferred 6 months ago to a private holding company. How would you know that? Corinne asked. Damon looked at her. Because I considered buying the same property 2 years ago. Charles leaned forward. And the holding company? Damon looked at Grant. Marwick Holdings. Grant's face went pale. Corinne stared. Why does that name sound familiar? Nobody answered. Then one of the investors at the far end spoke. Grant's mother's maiden name is Marwick. The room became completely still. Corinne didn't move. Grant did. He grabbed his phone. I'm leaving. Corinne stepped away from him rather than blocking him. Go. Grant paused. Maybe he expected her to stop him. She didn't. But tomorrow morning, she continued, our attorneys are going through every transaction you've approved in the last 18 months. Grant's eyes flashed. You'll regret embarrassing me like this. Corinne looked at him calmly. You embarrassed yourself. Grant stormed away from the table. Nobody followed. The elevator doors closed behind him. For several seconds, the restaurant was silent. Corinne slowly sat. Her hands were trembling now. Not because of Grant's anger. Because she understood how close she had come. The North Point purchase alone was worth $46 million. If Damon was right, she had nearly authorized her own company to buy an overpriced property from a company connected to the man advising her to purchase it. Charles looked at her. We're going to need to postpone tonight's investment decision. Corinne closed her eyes. I understand. Everything she had worked for seemed to collapse in that sentence. Without the investment, Westbridge couldn't expand. Without the expansion, 2 competitors would take the contracts she had spent years chasing. She looked down. Then Damon spoke. Postpone it. Corinne looked at him. He nodded toward Charles. He's right. For a moment, pain crossed her face. You just helped destroy the deal. No. Damon's voice remained steady. I stopped you from building your future on numbers you couldn't trust. She stared at him. He continued. If the company is strong, prove it again with clean numbers. Charles nodded. Exactly. Corinne looked between them. Charles smiled slightly. I said postpone. I didn't say withdraw. Hope flickered across her face. You'd reconsider? If you bring me a proposal I can trust. When? Charles looked at his watch. My investment committee meets Monday. Corinne almost laughed from disbelief. That's 4 days. Then I suppose you have a busy weekend. Damon closed the folder. Corinne looked at him. You saw problems in 30 seconds that my executives missed for months. Damon didn't answer. She leaned toward him. Help me. His expression changed. Corinne, please. I don't work for Westbridge in that capacity. You worked for Cole Meridian. That was another life. Apparently that other life just saved this one. Damon looked away. Charles watched them. Finally, Damon said, I'll look at the numbers. Corinne breathed out. Thank you. One condition. Anything. You stop calling me your driver tonight. Her face fell. Damon smiled. Because I'm off duty. Corinne stared at him for half a second before laughing. The tension around the table finally broke. Even Charles laughed. For the first time that evening, Damon smiled fully. And somehow, that simple moment changed the way Corinne saw him more than the tuxedo had. Not as a mysterious millionaire. Not as a former founder. Just as Damon. The man who had quietly been beside her for almost a year without ever demanding that she see him as anything more. By midnight, The dinner had ended, but Corinne and Damon didn't go home. They went to Westbridge headquarters. For the next 9 hours, they worked. The security staff watched in confusion as their CEO walked through the building at 1 a.m. beside the man they knew as her driver. Damon removed his tuxedo jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and took over an empty conference room. At first, Corinne tried to explain the business to him. After 20 minutes, she stopped. He already understood it. Not only the numbers, the structure, the routes, the labor model, the bottlenecks. He asked questions nobody on her executive team had asked. Why are these trucks returning empty? Why do you lease this warehouse instead of using overflow capacity here? Why are you paying 3 vendors for the same last-mile region? Every question uncovered another problem. Not fraud. Not necessarily. But waste. Complacency. Bad assumptions. By 4 a.m, Corinne had forgotten he was supposed to be her employee. They were arguing over expansion maps like 2 executives who had worked together for years. At one point, she stopped speaking. Damon looked up. What? She smiled tiredly. You're enjoying this. He looked at the spreadsheet. No. You are. I haven't done this in years. That doesn't answer me. Damon tried not to smile. Corinne pointed at him. There. That face. He laughed quietly. For the first time, she understood something. He hadn't stopped loving business. He had stopped trusting what business had turned him into. Around 6 a.m, Damon found the breakthrough. Westbridge didn't need $120 million. It needed 78. Corinne stared at the model. That can't be right. It is. We've been planning this expansion for 8 months. You've been planning Grant's version of the expansion. Damon turned the laptop toward her. You don't need 3 new warehouses. Then how do we cover the Midwest? You don't. She frowned. You partner. With whom? Damon typed a company name. Corinne stared. They're our competitor. They're your competitor in 2 markets. They're losing money in 6 others. You need their infrastructure. They need your contracts. Corinne slowly smiled. That's insane. Probably. It might work. Probably. She laughed. You're very annoying. I've been told. At 9 o'clock, Corinne's legal team arrived. By noon, they had confirmed the first nightmare. Marwick Holdings was indeed connected to Grant's family. By evening, they found 2 more undisclosed relationships. Grant had not simply made bad decisions. He had been positioning himself to profit personally from Westbridge's expansion. Corinne sat in her office reading the report. She looked devastated. Damon stood near the window. I trusted him. I know. For 7 years. Damon didn't give her empty reassurance. He knew what betrayal by a business partner felt like. Corinne looked at him. Is this what happened to you? He was silent. Not exactly. But close. Close enough. She stared at the papers. How did you come back from it? Damon looked out over the city. I didn't. She frowned. You're standing here. That's surviving. He turned toward her. Coming back is different. Corinne understood. And now? He looked at the laptop covered in Westbridge projections. A small smile appeared. Ask me Monday. Monday morning arrived. Charles Whitmore entered the Westbridge boardroom with 6 members of his investment committee. Corinne was prepared. But this time, Damon wasn't wearing a chauffeur's uniform. He wore a simple dark suit. No flashy watch. No dramatic entrance. He sat beside Corinne. When the presentation began, she spoke first. She didn't hide what had happened. She told them the original projections contained serious inaccuracies. She told them the CFO had been suspended pending investigation. She told them the entire expansion had been rebuilt in 72 hours. Then she did something nobody expected. She handed the presentation to Damon. Grant would have hated that. Damon stood. For 45 minutes, he dismantled every weakness in the old plan and replaced it with something stronger. He didn't oversell. When something was risky, he said it was risky. When a number was uncertain, he said it was uncertain. When one committee member challenged him, he didn't become defensive. He showed the data. Charles barely spoke. He just watched. At the end, Damon sat down. The committee left the room. Corinne exhaled. How bad? Damon shrugged. They didn't throw anything. She laughed nervously. 20 minutes later, Charles returned alone. Corinne stood. He placed the proposal on the table. We're in. She froze. All 78. Charles nodded. 78 million. Corinne covered her mouth. Months of pressure broke at once. She looked at Damon. He smiled. But Charles wasn't finished. There is one condition. Corinne's happiness vanished. What? Charles looked at Damon. We want him involved. Damon's smile disappeared. No. Corinne turned toward him. Charles continued. Not as a driver. No. Strategic advisor. No. Charles laughed. You haven't changed. Damon stood. I helped because Corinne needed it. I'm not returning to that world. Charles nodded. Then don't. Damon frowned. Charles gestured around the boardroom. Build a different one. Damon didn't answer. Corinne stepped closer. I won't pressure you. He looked at her. But if you stay, it won't be because I discovered who you used to be. She paused. It'll be because of who you've shown me you are. That mattered. Damon looked down. Almost 5 years earlier, when Coal Meridian collapsed, dozens of people had called him. Investors, journalists, executives, competitors. They all wanted the founder, the genius, the name. Nobody asked whether Damon Cole himself was okay. And now here was a woman who had known him first as a driver and respected him before knowing anything else. He looked at Charles. 3 months. Charles smiled. Corinne blinked. 3 months. Consulting. Her smile widened. I'll take it. And I choose my hours. Fine. And I'm not wearing a tie every day. She laughed. Damon. What? You've negotiated one sentence and you're already difficult. That's why Charles remembers me. 3 months became 6. Westbridge's expansion succeeded. The partnership Damon proposed saved millions. The company's biggest new contract came from a client Grant had insisted they couldn't win. And Grant. The internal investigation uncovered enough undisclosed conflicts that Westbridge removed him permanently. The company recovered part of its losses through legal settlement. But something else happened that surprised everybody. Damon never returned to being Corinne's full-time driver. He also never returned to being the man he had been at Coal Meridian. Instead, he accepted a position Corinne created specifically for him. Chief Strategy Partner. Not because he needed a title, but because he finally realized disappearing wasn't the same as healing. 6 months after that dinner, Corinne hosted another gathering in the exact same restaurant. Same skyline, same chandeliers, same long table. But the atmosphere was different. Employees were there. Drivers were there. Assistants were there. Executives were there. Corinne had insisted nobody be separated by title. Charles arrived late. When he entered, he saw Damon already seated. Still causing trouble? Damon smiled. Only expensive trouble. Charles laughed and sat beside him. Corinne stood to make a toast. Everyone raised their glasses. She looked around the room. A year ago, I thought leadership meant knowing everything happening inside your company. She glanced at Damon. I was wrong. Damon shook his head, already knowing where this was going. Corinne continued. Leadership is knowing enough to listen when somebody else sees what you've missed. She looked toward the employees. And sometimes the person everybody overlooks is the person who understands more than everybody at the table. The room applauded. Damon looked slightly embarrassed. Then Charles leaned toward him. You hate this, don't you? Completely. Good. Corinne finished her toast. But later, when the restaurant had emptied and the city lights reflected across the windows, she found Damon standing alone near the same entrance where he had appeared that first night. She walked beside him. You know something? What? When you walked through those doors, I thought the tuxedo was the surprise. Damon smiled. And now? The tuxedo was the least interesting thing about you. He laughed. Corinne looked through the glass at the city. Why didn't you ever tell me? He knew exactly what she meant. Because before you knew my past, you treated me like I mattered anyway. She turned toward him. And that surprised you? Yes. Corinne's smile faded. That makes me sad. It shouldn't. Why? Because that's why I trusted you enough to stay. For a moment neither said anything. Then Damon looked toward the empty dining table. Grant did get one thing right. Corinne raised an eyebrow. What? Damon smiled. I really didn't know which fork to use. Corinne stared at him. Then she burst out laughing. You are lying. Completely. I knew it. They walked toward the elevator together. Not CEO and driver. Not millionaire and employer. Just two people who had learned the same lesson from opposite sides of the table. Titles can disappear. Money can disappear. Companies can disappear. But character has a way of entering the room before your resume ever does. And the people we overlook today may be the very people we need tomorrow. So before you judge someone by the uniform they wear, the car they drive, the job they do, or the chair they sit in, remember Damon. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't silent because they have nothing to say. Sometimes they're simply waiting to see who you become before you discover who they are. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone you love, and tell us in the comments. Would you have treated Damon differently before discovering who he was?